Hello and welcome to Number Ninjas, where we ask the big questions in maths. This week, deadly decimals. Decimals are all around us, everywhere you look. And so,
This word decimals is very crazy. It comes from Latin decimus, which means tenths.
thank you, Maths Frog. Oh, here he comes again.
Did you know the decimal system was invented by Hindu mathematicians in India between the 1st and 6th centuries AD?
He's full of fascinating facts, is that Maths Frog. But now let's delve deeper into those deadly decimals. Okay, folks, so let's delve into decimal numbers. First thing that's really important to know is the place value headings of decimal numbers. So let's take a look at what we already know. We're already familiar with these place value headings. We've got the ones place, the tens place, the hundreds place, the thousands place, the 10,000s place, the 100,000s place, and the millions place. And each time we go from one place value column to the next, our numbers are getting bigger. Okay, so when we head to the left, our numbers are getting bigger. In fact, they're getting 10 times bigger. 10 ones makes a 10, quite obviously. 10 tens make 100. 10 hundreds make 1,000. 10,000 make 10,000. 10 10,000s make 100,000. And 10 100,000s makes 1,000,000. But our numbers don't just stop there. Our numbers keep going. They keep getting bigger and bigger as we go to the left. And our place value column headings get bigger as well. Because numbers are infinite, they just keep going. There is no biggest number, and they just keep getting bigger. So what happens when we go in the opposite direction? Numbers are infinite, they keep going this way, but they can also go the opposite way. Let's take a look at that. If we divide 1,000,000 by 10, we get 100,000. If we divide 100,000 by 10, we get 10,000, and so on down our place value columns. But what happens when we divide a 1 by 10, a unit by 10? Well, then we need to use this very important symbol here, the decimal point. And we end up with tenths, hundredths, and then thousandths, as we get 10 times smaller each column. And just like before, our numbers will keep getting smaller as we go to the right. They're infinite, they keep going, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. But for now, we just need to worry about these three columns, the tenths and the hundredths and the thousandths. Let's take an even closer look at what I'm talking about. I've colour-coded my place value headings with some shapes here to help us see what's happening. Here I have one unit, one whole one. Here, this yellow block. Well, beyond the decimal point, I've taken this one unit and split it into 10 equal parts. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I've shaded in one of them, this blue one here. That's 1/10, and it belongs in this column here, the tenths column. Then I took my tenths and I split them again the other way round. So I now have 100 pieces. So I took my 1 unit and split it into 100 equal pieces here. And I've shaded in one of them. And that is 1/100th. And it belongs in this column here, the hundredths column. Then if you imagine that I took my 100 squares and I divided each one of those squares into 10 more equal pieces, I've now got 1,000 pieces. 1,000 pieces. So that 1 unit split into 1,000 equal pieces. And I've shaded one in here. It's very small. And that's 1,000th. And it belongs in this column here, the thousandths column. So all you really need to remember, folks, is that the tenths, hundredths and thousandths are just one unit, one whole one, split into the number of parts in the heading. So the tenths, I've split my unit into 10 equal pieces. Hundredths, I split that 1 unit into 100 equal pieces. And thousandths, I've split that 1 unit into 1,000 equal pieces. Let's have a look now and see how we write these numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at tenths. I'm going to go straight ahead and shade one of these in. I need to remember to use my place value heading. So I've got my units. I'm going to draw a decimal point so I don't forget about it. And then I'm going to write in my tenths place. Okay, so how many whole ones do I have? Well, I can see I don't have a whole one. I don't have any. So I'm going to put in a 0. I have 0. I have no whole ones. I'm going to put in my decimal point, and then I'm going to count the number of tenths I have. And I have 1. So I'm going to write that in the tenths place like this. We say this number as 0.1. 0.1. Because decimals are a kind of fraction, I can also write them as a fraction one number over the top of another, like you might have seen before. So the first thing I need to ask myself is, how many parts do I have altogether? Well, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 10 parts. So I'm going to go ahead, draw in my fraction line and put 10 as my denominator. And how many of those parts do I have? Well, just like we said before, I have 1 part. So my numerator is going to be 1. Okay, so I can write my tenths either as a decimal, 0.1, or I can write them as a fraction, 1/10. Let's have a look at this other example. Well, again, to write this as a decimal, I think about how many units do I have. I have no units. I have no whole ones. So again, I put my 0 in, followed by a decimal point. How many tenths do I have now? Well, I have 9 tenths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So after the decimal point, I write 9. So my number now is 0.9. Again, to write this as a fraction, I write in my fraction line, I still have 10 parts, and I have 9 out of those 10 parts. I often find it really helps me to remember that a fraction is like saying out of. So I have 9 out of 10, bit like a spelling test score. Now I've got 10 out of 10 parts. I've got one whole one. So all I have to do is write 1. I haven't got any smaller parts, so I don't need a decimal point now. 10 tenths is the same as saying 1 whole 1, or unit. Again, I can write it as a fraction as 10 out of 10, but I don't really need to. It is the same as saying 1 whole unit. Now let's see what happens when we write hundredths. Here is my hundredths square. 1 whole unit split into 100 equal parts. So how do we go about writing these? Well, let's look at this new place value column heading. My units, my decimal point, my tenths, which we just talked about, and now this new one, the hundredths. Again, I can ask myself questions to help me work out how to write this number down. Do I have any whole units? I don't. So I simply put in a 0, followed by a decimal point. Do I have any tenths? Well, I don't. It will fill this whole column. I don't have any tenths. So again, I need to put a 0. How many hundredths do I have? Well, I have 1 of them. So in my new column, my hundredths column, I'm going to put a 1. And just like my tenths, I can write these as fractions, one number over the top of another. So let's go ahead and do that. I put in my fraction line. Well, how many parts do I have altogether? That tells me my denominator. Well, I know there are 100, so I'm going to put 100 on the bottom of my fraction. And how many of those 100 have I got? I've got 1, so I'm going to put 1 on the top of my fraction. Again, this is the decimal 0.01, and this is my fraction 1/100th. I've created a new decimal number. Let's have a look at it. Here I've got 1 row of 10, or a tenth, and 8 hundredths shaded in. Well, how on earth do I write this? Let's go back to our place value column headings to help us. I still don't have any whole units, so my 0 stays the same. But this time I've got 1/10 and 8 hundredths. So I'm going to write 1 in the tenths place and an 8 in the hundredths place. It would be really tempting now to call this 0.18, but it isn't. We read this number 0.18. How do I write this as a fraction? I draw in my fraction line, and my denominator is still 100 because I've got 100 pieces altogether. How many of those pieces do I have? Well, I have 18 of them. So I'm going to write 18 above. When I read a fraction like this, I can say 18 hundredths, but my decimal is always 0.18. Can you work out what this decimal would be? Pause the video if you need a bit more time. That's right, it's 0.69. 0.69. And how would you write that as a fraction? Again, pause the video if you need a bit more time. Spot on. I still have 100 parts, and now I have 69 of them. So I have 69 hundredths. Let's move on and have a look now what happens when we divide that 1 unit into 1,000 parts. Now we come to the thousandths place, and this is really exciting, a brand new place value column. You can see I've taken my 1 unit and divided it up into 1,000 equal pieces. So let's go right ahead. We already know we don't have any units. And we don't have any tenths. We don't even have any hundredths. But we do have 1,000th shaded in. We read this number as 0.001. We can also write this as a fraction. I'll go ahead and draw my fraction line, and my denominator will be 1,000, because that's how many parts I have altogether. And how many of those parts are shaded? Well, we've got 1. So I'm going to write that as my numerator. Read this number as 1,000th. This time the number's a little bit trickier. I still don't have any units, no whole ones. And I don't have any tenths. But now I do have some hundredths shaded in. I have 3 of them. And I have 5 thousandths shaded in. I read this number as 0.035. And as a fraction, 1,000 is my denominator, and 35 will go on the top of my fraction. I'd read this as 35 thousandths. I wonder if you can figure out what this number would be. I do have tenths, hundredths and thousandths in this number. Pause the video if you need a little bit of time to solve this one. That's right, I have 0 units, I have 3 tenths, I have 6 hundredths, and I have 5 thousandths. Again, it's really tempting to read this as 0.365, but it isn't. We always read decimal numbers as single digits, like this, 0.365. When I write it as a fraction, with 1,000 as my denominator, I put 365 as my numerator. When I read it as a fraction, I read it as 365 thousandths. Now let's see if we can solve some problems that your teacher might give you involving these kinds of numbers. What is the value of the underlying digit? Well, let's have a look here. 0.145, 0.732 and 0.063. Pause the video if you need more time. Well, the 1 is in the tenths place. So this 1 is worth 1/10. The 2 in this number is in the thousandths place. So it's worth 2/1000ths. And the 6 in this number is in the hundredths place. So it's worth 6/100ths. You could write these as fractions. 1/10, 2/1000ths and 6/100ths. Let's check out the next question. Write down the numbers in the tenths place. Pause the video if you need more time. That's right. The number in the tenths place in this first number, 0.679, is 6. Number in the tenths place in the second number, 0.892, is 8. Well done if you got those right. This question is very similar to the last, so it's really important we read it carefully. Write down the numbers in the thousandths place. Pause the video if you need more time. That's it, you've got it. The first question, the number in the thousandths place is 9, and the second, it's 2. This last question asks us to write down two numbers with a 4 in the hundredths place. Pause the video if you need more time. We need to be really careful with our place value headings here. We're going to have a 0 in the units place, must put in our decimal point, then we can write any digit we like in the tenths. I'm going to choose a 7. A 4 in our hundredths place, and then I'm going to put a 2 in my thousandths place. My second number, I'm going to put a 0 in the units place. Make sure I remember my decimal point. I'm going to put an 8 in the tenths place and a 4 in the hundredths place. But this time I'm not going to put a number in the thousandths place, and I've still answered the question. I wonder what numbers you came up with.
That's all the time we have for Number Ninjas this week. Adios, amigos!